Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you as always on this fabulous Thursday in which we are releasing our latest podcast. And today's podcast is focused on operating model. Now, we are running a campaign at the moment. It's called Demystifying the HR Operating Model. But if you are a regular follower of the things that we do at Lace, you'll be well aware that we have a variety of different services and practices and offerings that we deliver. And so what I wanted to do today is get a podcast veteran of Lace Partners, Mr. Chris Kirby, who is a key member and senior manager within our payroll practice, to have a chat with me today about operating model, but with a payroll lens. How are you doing, mate? You all right?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Chris. Feeling more like a veteran every day.
Feeling more like a veteran, and particularly given that Chelsea are playing so appallingly as they're up and down, I guess. You've got a cup final at the time of recording, haven't you?
Yeah, no comment.
So I wanted to talk about payroll operating models. We want to just do a bit of where to start is probably a bit of an overlay. So on our HR operating model, Demystifying HR Operating Model campaign, we talk about the different types of HR op models there are that exist and what goes into an operating model. So, there's things around the technology and the structure and stuff like that. So can you just help our listeners out who are listening in just to talk from a payroll lens? What do we talk about when we're talking about payroll operating models?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's very similar to HR. So it's the same thing. We tend to look at it through the lens of people, clearly. So touching on your point around how it's structured, process. So how does the end-to-end process flow, and looking at the players involved in that and how the structure impacts that. Mm-hmm. Technology clearly plays a key role, but certainly not the be-all and end-all. And also data is becoming far more important, particularly in global operating models, that data has its own solution and role to play in that. It's no longer just a part of the system. So yeah, holistically, it's that end-to-end picture. How is the company structured? What they're using? Who's doing it? And where are those people?
Yeah. Okay. And so let's then delve into why we break it down into that section. Like, why is it actually important to break it down into those particular component parts? And I guess this may be a second question, so you can answer the first one first and then get to the second one you want, really, is like, do we get people coming to us that just focus in on one section, for example? And do you spend a lot of time then having to tell people, have you thought about this holistically?
100%. It's quite an old-fashioned term, but it's one that I still use quite a lot, is symptoms versus causes.
Yeah, and we have a blog on that, don't we? So what we'll do in the show notes, we'll drop a little link to the blog as well, so that we can reference that in. Is that the elephant in the room?
No, I think it was actually called Resolving Causes, Not Symptoms. But ultimately, it points to whatever the reason is a client has approached Lace, it's likely that what they've approached us for is because they're encountering a symptom or a number of symptoms. And one of the things that we really focus on is getting down to the cause of those things, because that's what ultimately you need to resolve to ensure, success in the future, not just put a plaster over the symptom. When we think about those buckets I spoke about at the beginning, often the symptom will be in technology. So people will come to us and tell us the technology isn't optimal, it's broken, it's not doing what it needs to do. When we actually start working with them and start to, work backwards from there, what we'll often find is the reason that whatever it is wrong in the technology is because actually the people involved don't really know what their role is, or there's other technology that's linking into the technology where the issues are being faced that isn't working or isn't working in tandem, not integrating with that technology. And the other key point is process. So not only do the people need to be very clear on what they're doing, what their role is, how it's done, and where they fit, but the process needs to be robust. So it's very easy to give people a system or give people some data and say, this is your job, but how do they actually operate that? How does that process link in with everything else? So maybe they've got a service center, maybe they've got 20 countries and each one of those is served by a local market. They might even have payroll people out in their front line markets. You know, if you're a retailer, for example, you might have people in shops that are operating payroll. So all of those things need to come together and be considered to ensure that whatever the process, whatever the data, whatever the people are that you've got in the mix, that they're not creating a bunch of issues, either in the technology or indeed in the payroll output itself.
So again, this pod is around the payroll operating model. It's about kind of thinking about everything, the whole bucket, if you like. In your experience, maybe you can draw on people that we speak to at LACE, but also maybe even prior to your experience before joining LACE as well. I'm thinking about how many payroll teams do you think there are out there that really do think about this at an operating model level? Because you talked about most of the times people go to us and it's about the technology. And is that because they're so focused in on that granular particular issue? Like how many, in your experience, businesses will at least have an idea that we do need to look at our overarching model? Do you spend a lot of time trying to educate and say, guys, you're looking at the technology side, you've got to focus on everything?
We do spend a lot of time doing that. And so to answer the first question, I think it's difficult because certain companies will be aware of it. And a lot of that will be dependent on whether there's maybe an internal transformation team, which is fairly common in large organizations, and they will be, taking that more holistic view. But we do, a lot of the clients that we work with just haven't even thought about it. And one of the common things that I come across, and indeed I've come across it again recently with one of our clients, is I think most payroll functions recognize they've got issues, that there's challenges. And in most payroll functions, they're documenting those. So there'll be an issue log, there'll be, here's everything that's gone wrong over the last X amount of time. And the question that I always ask when presented with those is, okay, so what do you do with that? Where does it go from here? Because the core, when we think about an operating model, is to get back to where those issues are stemming from, not just knowing their issues and saying you've resolved them. How do we stop them happening again is the most important part. So the answer to that question is so often, nothing. It's just a log. And,
It's file somewhere.
Exactly. We've resolved it. We've made a payment to cover it. We've, taken that out. We've put that in manually or whatever it is, but we didn't actually then do anything with it. And it's that thought process that isn't commonplace, I don't think, across the whole market, certainly, that really needs to be recognised to make sure that you're considering the full operating model. And indeed, it goes wider than the payroll operating model, because really payroll is often a part of a broader HR, finance, reward operating model.
Yeah. And I just want to think about some of the conversations we've had around, and we'll be doing some more work around, getting the basics right, stuff like that. I kind of want you to reflect a little bit on this idea that the payroll function often is seen as, if it's doing its job and people are getting paid, then that's kind of tick the box. And is it because people who work within the payroll function are so focused on those elements, and because it's such a repeatable sort of action that needs to happen, and so their time is filled up, or it's filled up with these sticking plasters, do you get a lot of people almost saying, and maybe you were hinting at this, so perhaps expand on it with your previous question around, specific teams in bigger businesses that can look at this sort of stuff, transformation teams. What about those teams that don't have those transformation teams in place? I might have a payroll person listening to this going, I haven't got time to do all this. I'm too busy. My team's running the payroll and we're solving these quick fixes. How do I get the thinking space to actually then do it? Like to do the kind of analysis of my operating model?
There's no, magic answer. I can't just, say, do this and it's solved. But certainly, even within an existing payroll model, operating model, I would always recommending that, there's a provision made for governance and change and improvement. Now, that's easier said than done. You're absolutely right. People can't just click their fingers and suddenly have capacity. And it might be that either you have to go through some short-term pain to get the long-term gain. And ultimately, the more of the things that are causing you issues and causing you to be so, snowed under at that moment, the more of those you can fix, the more capacity you'll have to be thinking more proactively and thinking forward. So you naturally, can carve out that capacity by focusing on some of these things. I think, as I said, there's no silver bullet, but at the same time, I think a short-term focus, short-term bit of work, potentially a project, whatever it may be, to understand, okay, let's just step back. Where are we? Where aren't we as well? And how in the capacity we do have in the team, what can we focus on? How long is that going to take? How can we resolve that over the next X amount of time? And that doesn't need to be a month. You have to be realistic. It might be that it's going to take 6 months. It might be that it's going to take a year alongside everything else that's happening. But doing nothing shouldn't be an option.
Yeah, it's just you're never ever going to start. You're always going to be that sticking plaster sort of function, aren't you? If you do nothing. Let's talk specifically about the different types of operating models that you come across. What I want you to do is, if you can just talk through some of those operating models that we've talked about before we went live, and then also at the same time, for each one of those different operating models, talk about kind of like when you've seen it done really, really well, what are the kind of things that people should be looking out for? Because I can imagine there's people that will be listening into this that maybe they operate under that hybrid model or an outsourced model or a managed service model, that sort of thing. So when it looks good, how does that manifest itself from your experience in working in the payroll space?
And this is a good question. I think, first of all, it's good that we've got this far through the podcast, and this is the first time we've mentioned any of the phrases outsourced or in-house, because I think there's a lot of people that get bogged down in thinking that's it. Mm-hmm. When you talk about a payroll operator model, it means how do you engage with your provider? And that isn't the case. The payroll operator model is much broader than that and more holistic. So when we talk around the likes of, an in-house, a hybrid model, an outsourced model, or different managed services, service centers, those sorts of things, they generally sit with a focus on the provider, largely. Now, most of the time, in-house is only going to be viable for large organization. I think it comes with a certain amount of cost, both in terms of actually buying the technology. It carries with it a lot of maintenance in terms of you'll have a certain amount of responsibility yourself in terms of building, maintaining, the code, and therefore issues become yours to a certain extent. And the costs of that also extend beyond payroll. So you're starting to talk about an IT team who will need to have resources dedicated to that, et cetera, et cetera. That said, it can, and I've worked with it, I've owned it, I've seen it, work very well. So in a certain type of organization in particular, where there's an awful lot of complexity and maybe bespoke stuff that needs to go on in order to have an optimized payroll, having that in-house platform and a lot of control over what you do, how you do it, can give you some significant benefits. As I say, it is a constant balancing act, because while it's possible to do it, you have to be taking into account the extended cost of being able to do that, and also the risk. Mm-hmm. So let's jump to the opposite of that, which is outsourced. And really, we're talking there about you've just given it all to somebody else. So you may have genuinely nobody internally, and you might have local HR resources who are just tasked with filling out a form or a spreadsheet or whatever, and everything is just managed for you by a payroll provider. Now, clearly there, you don't need to have internal expertise, which you would have with like an in-house model. You save on a lot of the technology costs. Like I say, they go somewhere else, and they might be a bit cheaper because you're getting the economies of scale benefit of their software. And that suits an awful lot of companies. I keep referring to scale, I know, but that's a key determining factor here, because just giving all of your payroll to somebody else, if you've got 200,000 employees in 55 countries with a ton of different, bargaining agreements and contracts and everything, is not really going to suit your model. And that's really where we move into some of the other options. So I think managed service is a bit of an extension of outsourced, where you've given them everything, but then you just get that service layer thrown over the top. And then we get into what's a very common landscape now, which is this hybrid model. So a lot of the companies we deal with are clearly global. They've got presence across a number of different countries, different regions. And therefore, even from a commercial angle alone, it's very difficult to make the same bit of technology that's viable for, let's say, 50,000 employees in one country, also viable for a location that's only got 8 employees. Ultimately, the capability you're going to need for the 50,000, you're probably not going to need for the 8, and therefore the pricing's highly unlikely to be competitive. So a lot of the time what we see is this hybrid model where you'll have a number of core locations supported by either in-house or maybe a managed service with a large provider. And then what is often referred to as the long tail, smaller headcount, much more simple payroll, served by another provider, and that will likely be on a managed service or even an outsourced basis. I think the last thing just to call out is, as I said, it is much broader than just the provider and the service you get. Is internally, there's the service center angle. And I've mentioned this before, but a lot of how payroll works, a lot of how efficient payroll is impacted by if you've got a service center set up internally, even if that doesn't extend to payroll, ultimately there's going to be some links. You know, if you've got a HR service center, but you've got local payroll teams currently, ultimately they're using the same data. And from a broader operating model perspective, you want to avoid HR doing the same work as payroll. Those two things should still link in some way. So a service center internally also adds a significant lens to those operating models.
So you talk quite a bit there about companies that we work with that have a global presence. Sometimes they've got, hundreds or thousands of people in a location. Sometimes it's 5, 6, 7, 8, that long tail that you mentioned as well. What about people that are working in UK-based businesses? Obviously, we are operating in the UK and we work with lots of UK-based businesses as well. And some of the challenges that they face, perhaps, because as I mentioned, we've touched quite a bit on the global side, but let's zone in just on that UK side as well. Just give us some thoughts around some of the challenges that the UK guys will face in terms of their operating models.
Fundamentally, one of the challenges if you are operating in one market is the justification for not having, an outsourced or a managed service payroll. Now, you and I have spoken about this many times, and it doesn't just come down to scale, and it doesn't just come down to geographical sort of structure. Complexity is a key angle here as well. A client with significant time and attendance requirements, for example, or a bunch of old, policies and maybe a remote workforce, disconnected workforce or whatever, they'll all have different requirements. But at a principal level, though, if you are just operating in one jurisdiction, it can sometimes be quite hard. We speak to clients a lot who struggle to maintain the argument for keeping their payroll internally. I'm actually working with a client now who's been, we've been working with them to help them with this argument internally, essentially, which is at a board level, they're challenging, why have we got an in-house payroll? We're one country. It's quite straightforward. Why aren't we just getting the benefit of giving it to somebody else? But the reality is they're an incredibly complex organization. We're talking seasonal workers. The majority of their workforce are disconnected. Their current technology is so poor, even though it's in-house, that they've got a significant internal presence and therefore overhead to maintain that. So there's a big disconnect between board sort of attitude and the simple question, which is why aren't we just simple, and the reality of being able to operate that payroll day to day. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, but a lot of them are common, whether it's global or local. In the UK, thankfully, the majority of the back end of payroll is automated. A lot of the authorities we have to report to, it can be done automatically. It's fairly common now that things like benefits and pensions and all sorts are automated via either, templates or genuine integrations. In some other countries, that's not the case. And if you're only operating in Germany, for example, or somewhere around the Iberian region, you might have a hard requirement to have people on the ground locally to carry on some of the tasks. And that then poses a challenge to thinking about doing things differently, because you're always going to need that presence to carry out those tasks.
We're nearing the end of kind of the quiz section that I wanted to quiz you on in terms of in relation to payroll operating models. I guess one of the things that we want to leave our listeners with is more around the types of questions that they want to be asking themselves if they're thinking. As you've talked about right at the beginning, quite often businesses will just be zoning in on something like the technology. And so maybe there are some people that haven't even thought about it from an operating model level. But if they are now thinking about, okay, is our operating model the right thing for us? What are the types of questions or recommendations, just to finish it off, that you would say to somebody listening in, like, ask yourself these questions, or talk amongst the payroll team, ask yourself these questions? What kind of advice would you give?
I think if the reason somebody's asking the question in the first place is just because they're asking the question, and maybe someone's mentioned it, maybe they've read it, seen it, heard it, or maybe they're listening to this podcast and considering it. I think the first place to start is to understand where you're at today. Okay, so do you know where you're at today? How efficient is your payroll function performing? Now, it's entirely possible they're not even tracking that. If so, start tracking it. Use some of the benchmarking metrics. Make sure you understand what those issues are. So, I think broadly, if you're coming at it from that angle, it's just a case of, do you know where you're at today? So before you even start considering how you could be tomorrow, you need to know where you are today. If the question's being asked because there's issues, so we've got a bunch of challenges, do you know what the cause of those challenges is? So have you jumped to operating model? It's the same thing we say about technology. Have you just jumped to assuming if you change provider or technology, this issue is going to go away? Because if you're making that judgment based on a bunch of symptoms and you don't know what the causes of those problems are, then ultimately you don't know that anything to do with your operator model is going to resolve them.
I think probably one of the Chris Kirby trademark phrases is causes and symptoms. And that's probably one thing that you'd take away, certainly to give to listeners, because focus in on what are those causes rather than what other symptoms are. But Chris, absolutely amazing to get your insight today. Thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you. It's been enjoyable as usual, Chris.
As always. You can, of course, get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on Apple, on Spotify, on the Lace Partners website, which is lacepartners.co.uk/podcast. On behalf of myself and on behalf of Chris, thank you very much for listening. And we hope to see you, hear you, speak to you, or you listening and hearing and speaking to us in the next and future editions of the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.